Once more, we are learning from this book, Winning with Chess Psychology, written by Pal Benko. It's really interesting, partly for the anecdotes, partly for the behind the scene, what was actually going in the mind of this grandmaster in a period that there were probably like 50 grandmasters all over the world, because the book is written in 1991, but when he shows us the game against Fischer in 1960, I don't think there were more than 50 grandmasters in the world, 50, 55, because I think in Fischer, when he won the World Championship in 1972, I think there were like 88 grandmasters. So this game is played in Buenos Aires in 1960. Again, the game is very short, but it's interesting what Pal Benko says. By the way, for sake of clarity, I thought I was paid $3, $4. I paid $7 for this book. Okay, so I even know the precise price. D4, Knight F6, C4, G6. G3, wow, totally different move. Bishop G7, Bishop G2, Castle, Knight C3, D6, Knight F3, Knight C6, and here it says that the usual choices were Castle in D5, but he played H3, which is a dubious move. Okay, why? Because it says by now Bobby was a real expert on this opening, so as in our previous game I wanted to get him out of the books and into unfamiliar territory. So imagine the previous game was played in 1958. So 2 years later, clearly Fischer is a master of this opening. He doesn't want to go in his opening repertoire because that would be a loss. And so what does he say? The idea of this move is simply to prepare Bishop E3 without having to worry about Knight G4, okay? That attack the Bishop on E3. But it clearly loses a tempo, because you have moved the H-pawn. My opinion at the time was that the strategic objective was worth a tempo, but I also had a psychological trap in mind. Grandmaster Edmar Madness wrote of this move that it was based strictly on psychological factors. For example, on White's hope that Black would overreach himself in storming a safe bastion. Contrary to my hopes, however, Fischer achieves a good position and turns my experiment into a failure, but he then falls victim to another kind of psychological pitfall. So let's see what happens, okay? E5, and here White played castle, but he says maybe Bishop E3 should be played right away. Okay, now we don't care much about that. We want to see what happens that Fischer turned this opening from a good line for him to something that he lost. E takes D4, Knight takes D4, Knight takes D4. Very heavy this knight. Queen takes D4, and now there is a good move by Fischer, Bishop E6, developing rapidly to harass White's exposed queen. And he says if Bishop to B7, Bishop to take H3, proving the disadvantage of the move. So what does White play? Queen H4, which seems the best. knight d7, which is good. Although it looks simple, a maneuver like this is not easy to find. Black now threatens to gain the upper hand by trading off white's active queen. Well, because it moves also white. But he doesn't want to trade off, so he plays bishop g5, f6, bishop e3. By the way, you must not play this. Why? Because after this move you lose the pawn c4, okay? So that's why he goes back to e3. And now Fischer played g5. Later I saw this move mentioned somewhere. Though it had been given a question mark, nothing better was suggested. It's not a bad move, for the alternatives allow white to consolidate. Now white's queen gets pushed around some more, giving me real misgivings about my opening idea. Queen d4 again, and obviously if he played queen e4 there was rook e8, okay? And that would have been a problem. So what does black play? Obviously f5, queen d2, f4, g takes f4, g takes f4, okay? And now there is bishop takes f4. And how does black continue? He continue with knight b6. And this is the point of Bobby's pawn sacrifice. He threatens to activate his knight with knight takes c4, right? And the c-pawn can't be protected by b3 because then he would take here, right? So this is a thing. If you play b3, rook takes f4, queen takes f4, boom, bishop takes c3. So very good, right? For black. So what does white play on this move? Play the queen e3, trying to make things as difficult as possible for black and hoping to turn my dubious 7th move, h3, into a mere lost tempo that gave black equal chances. And now it seems that black started to have moves that were not so good. Queen f6. This may be where black begins to go wrong. Though the queen seems to be in an aggressive position at the moment, it will prove to be misplaced on the king side. The quieter queen d7 looks better, which keeps the initiative. Okay? Bishop g5, queen g6, and queen g3. Now black takes on c4, and here it says, thanks to white's sly queen move, this capture does not gain a tempo. The knight would now be attacking the queen and it remain on e3. So if the queen was still there, it would have gained a tempo, right? But it seems that probably instead of knight takes c4, it was better to play this or rook e8. Okay? So that's an interesting observation. Fischer's error was the result of overconfidence. He knew he was getting the advantage and probably thought there was no danger. He even seemed to have expected my reply, though obviously he misjudged his strength. So what do you think is white reply? What do you think it is white reply at this point? Okay? Well, I hope you pause the video, try to find what is white reply. White reply is boom, knight d5. And you say, haha, but knight d5 is not good. Well, if you play this, you just lost that, right? Down, check, and this is gone. So obviously you cannot really touch that knight. Sorry, the bishop wasn't here, it was only 6. But the problem is that, like he said, it's overconfidence. He expected this move, but maybe he didn't see far enough to refute that. So he plays queen f7, and he says Bobby played this rather quickly, defending the c pawn and the e7 square and threatening bishop takes d5. Okay, but his best chance was rook f7, giving up the exchange with knight e7, but getting the b pawn as a compensation. Okay, instead he played queen f7. So what does white play at this point, right? This is the important thing to know. White plays bishop takes bishop h6, right? Because if black plays bishop takes d5, obviously the threat is bishop takes g7, he says. I don't know. I think if he plays bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes g7, checkmate, no? Right? So it cannot play bishop takes d5 clearly. That's the reason. No? But what does he play then, black? He played c6, and now bishop takes g7, queen takes g7, queen takes g7, king takes g7, and now we have this, right? That, oops, that's the problem. That's the real problem, right? King f6, knight takes a8, rook takes a8, and here, this is a funny thing. After b3, black resigned. Can you imagine? Fischer resigned. Bobby's resignation came as a surprise, since 27 knight e3 would have offered strong resistance, though white's win was fairly certain. I was even more surprised 10 years later when he told me he had resigned this game prematurely. Even after all that time, he still looked at his old games, especially the ones he lost. So here we also have a lesson from Fischer, right? He lost the game, 10 years later he's still watching that game. I think he gave up early because he simply found it distasteful to play position in which he had no chance to be active. I'm not proud of that game. My opening novelty was a strategic failure, and I won only because of Bobby's overconfidence later on. The basis of my psychological trap was Fischer's well-known love for the initiative, which is essentially an advantage in time. He believed, as have other players and theoreticians, that white's first move advantage, properly exploited, should amount to virtually a forced win. Okay, so again, I believe this book is really interesting because he really questioned the psychology in chess, which is what we project in a game over the board. Because you see, when we look at some moves and not some others, when we resign in some positions, when we think that a certain endgame is a draw and it is not, maybe, again, we are projecting our psyche, our mind. And so you can see in these two games, Benko destroyed Bobby Fischer, that obviously was young and had to learn from that. I'm not saying he didn't have to learn. So it's very important, because Fischer probably gained much more experience from these losses than if he would have won against Benko. Because these losses still haunted him 10 years later. And he was still replaying those games in his mind to understand what happened, why it happened, and what he could do to change that. So again, I believe this book is quite interesting. I hope maybe you find it too and you will read it. Thank you very much.